Okay.
We're live.
Okay, good evening. I'm Andrea Peskin-Katz, the founder of GreatThoughts.com and GreatThoughts.readers, and we are thrilled to be with you tonight. First, I want to thank Get Ready PR for setting this up and having so many great historical fiction authors together. Historical fiction is my favorite genre, and I'm honored to join this elite group. I love chatting with historical fiction authors because they always have weird and zany tidbits of their research. Tonight is especially exciting because join me in congratulating Joy Jordan Lake on her release today of Under a Gilded Moon. Congratulations, Joy. And I'd also like to welcome authors Fiona Davis, Jane Healy, Ariel Lawhon, and Lauren Willick. In the chat section, you will find affiliate links to buy all of their books at either bookshop.org, which sells them from independent bookstores, or from Amazon, and we hope you will buy or pre-order a bunch of books tonight. I'm going to introduce each panelist. I'm going to ask them to share a bit about themselves and their books. After all five have introduced themselves, then we're going to chat about their research and find out what went into the creation of all of these books. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will look at them after we hear from each author, and then we can chat about them. So let me introduce our panelists, and we will hear from each. Fiona Davis, batting first, is the author of The Lions of Fifth Avenue, which is her sixth book. She began her career in New York City as an actress. After getting a master's at Columbia, she fell in love with writing, and aren't we lucky she did, and went from being an editor to a journalist to writing fiction. And I love this part. The Lions of Fifth Avenue was a Good Morning America book club pick, yay! And then it hit the New York Times bestseller list, and that's amazing. The book centers around the New York Public Library, and I especially love this starred review that the book got from Publishers Weekly. Davis delves into the history of the New York Public Library in this delightful mystery. The characters and stories are stellar, but the real star of the show is the library, which Davis evokes beautifully. Fiona, my friend, welcome. Please tell us a bit about you and your book.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you so much, and to the whole Great Thoughts, Great Readers community for, it's such an incredible place. I visit every day to find out what's going on. So thank you for being our fearless leader. So I grew up with English parents, and we'd go back to England every 3 years to visit all the relatives. And we'd travel all over to grand estates and, palaces and ruins. And they'd let me and my brother out of the car to run wild to kind of use up some energy. And so I just fell in love with old buildings and, imagining kind of the ghosts of maids who walked the halls in the Middle Ages, or, what was it like for the aristocrat in the 1800s? And so when it came to writing books, it's really no surprise that I ended up kind of setting every book in a landmark building. They're all in New York City so far. Like the Barbizon Hotel for Women, or Grand Central, or the Chelsea Hotel. And so the latest book is The Lions of Fifth Avenue, set at the New York Public Library. And I like dual timeline mystery, kind of dual timeline historical fiction with an element of mystery that really drives the story forward. And so that's the kind of book I write. So Lions is set in two timelines. In 1913, it's from the point of view of the superintendent's wife at the New York Public Library, a woman named Laura. And she lives in an apartment deep inside the library, which actually existed, with her husband and her two children. And she's surrounded by all these books and all this knowledge, but she wants something more out of life. And so she applies to Columbia Journalism School and gets in, and her world is really cracked wide open. And then the other timeline is 1993. And that's from the point of view of a curator of rare books at the library called Sadie. And she's about to put on this huge exhibit of rare books when one goes missing. And she's drawn into a series of book thefts that happened 80 years ago, as well as the terrible tragedy that happened to the superintendent's family back then. And I like to say it's about the magic of the written word and the power of women's voices.
I love that. And my grandmother's name was Sadie, which I told you. So I especially love that. And interestingly, both Pam Jenoff and Jamie Brenner had books coming out with Sadie's in them. So I love that.
I'm on
Thank you,
trend.
Fiona.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, we have my friend Jane Healy. Jane launched a career in high tech to become a freelance writer to fulfill her dream of writing historical fiction. And boy, has she. She specializes in stories about little-known women in history. Now Jane is an Amazon charts and Washington Post best-selling author of the Beantown Girls and the Saturday Evening Girls Club. Jane's next book, The Secret Stealers, will publish on April 1st next year. I love the blurb that Linda Loigman gave to Jane. Once again, Healy gifts readers with her trademark characters, everyday women who prove themselves to be extraordinary. Women so relatable and endearing and so brave that they jump off the page and into our hearts. And that's just the perfect description of Jane's books. Jane, thank you for being here. Tell us a bit about you and your book.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for everything you do for writers. Thank you to the Great Thoughts community. I'm so happy to be here to celebrate joy tonight and to tell you a little bit about my next book. As Andrea said, I like to write about lesser known stories of women in history and women who end up having different choices because of the historical time periods that they're in. So The Secret Stealers came about, I keep kind of a running file of possible book ideas. And I came across this article about this woman. She was 100 years old and her name was Stephanie Czech Rader. And her neighbors discovered that at the very end of the war, she had been a spy in Poland for the Office of Strategic Services. She was an American spy in Poland. Her family had immigrated to America from Poland. And so the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, was the precursor to the CIA in World War II. And so the CIA actually, when she was 100 years old, honored her with an award because she was one of the few women in the OSS who had gone undercover as a female spy. And so that kind of intrigued me. I knew about the SOE, who were female spies in the SOE. I knew about female spies in the French Resistance. I didn't realize that there were American female spies, to be honest. And so I started digging, and then I found another article about these two women who were living in a retirement community outside Washington, D.C. One was in her 80s, one was in Doris, and Betty was in her 90s. She was 96. And they discovered, when they were living there, that they had both been spies with the OSS and then worked for the CIA for several years after that, and had never knew of each other, but became best friends when they were, in their old age. And even at that point, they had never kind of really they were still very hesitant to share their secrets because they were so well trained. Even in their 80s and 90s, they were still kind of held back in interviews, and but they were able to share these experiences and stories with each other. And so after I found that article, I was kind of hooked on who are these women? How many were there? What did they do? So I started, kind of coming up with an outline, and my main character, Anna Cavanaugh, is kind of a composite of some of these different female spies from the OSS. She was recruited by General William Donovan, who founded the OSS. He was a family friend, and that's because they had to build the organization so quickly. Donovan had to. He recruited from friends and family very, very fast. They built it up to 13,000 people very quickly during the early years of the war. And so she speaks multiple languages. She's a French teacher. She's widowed. She lost her husband in the war, and she's looking for something, she's yearning for something more in her life and her career. And so Donovan recruits her to really be an analyst and work in Washington, D.C., where she was living, but she convinces him to let her train to be a spy because of her language abilities and because of her desire to do that. Again, there wasn't many of them who were OSS female spies, and I still have yet to find an exact number because a lot of those things are still classified. They only declassified the personnel files of the OSS in 2008. So there's still a lot of unknowns. So this is about Anna and her journey from teacher to spy, and she ends up living in Paris, where she had spent some time as an undergrad, and becoming and reuniting with a friend who's also involved in the French Resistance, named Josette Rousseau, who's also based on a spy named Genet de Clarence Rousseau, who was a spy with the French Resistance. So that's kind of in a nutshell, what the story is about. There's a lot of other little interesting details, but
I love it. And I might point out for everybody on tonight, Jane does some of the best webinars about her research, and they're really fascinating. So we can't get into them at all tonight, but try to catch one.
Thank you.
Also on Joy's website, she has amazing background of behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah.
So that's also something everybody should check out. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Ariel Lawhon. Ariel is a critically acclaimed New York Times bestselling author of historical fiction. She's written 5 books. Her books have been Library Reads, One Book, One County, Indie Next, Costco, Amazon Spotlight, and Book of the Month Club selections. Codename Helene is her newest book, which came out March 31st. So she was definitely our pandemic book baby. In a starred review, book page says, a spellbinding work of historical fictions and one of the most sensual romance novels you'll ever read. She is real. This really did happen is the mantra you may find yourself repeating in awe of every page. I love that review. Ariel, please tell us a bit about yourself and codename Helene.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. Thank you for having me. Thank you. Joy invited me. I'm really glad to be here with all of my fellow authors. And one day I hope we will all get to meet in person the way that we used to. As Andrea said, I'm Ariel Lawhon. I live in Nashville, Tennessee with my husband and 4 boys. It's bananas here all the time and has only gotten crazier with lockdown. But my new novel is called Codename Helene. It is based on the life of a woman named Nancy Wake. And to be honest with you, I'd never heard of her until I was sitting in a hotel room in Buffalo, New York. I was on tour for my 2nd novel, and I was waiting for an event to start. And I got an email from the mother of an old friend. And she said, Ariel, you may have never heard of this woman. Her name is Nancy Wake. She's a legend down under. We love her in Australia. And I think she'd make a great subject for a novel. And if you don't write about her, we can no longer be friends. You can ask my real mother. I'm not very good at being told what to do, but I adore this woman. So I read the link to an article she sent me, and I was astonished at what I found. Nancy Wake left home at 16 years old. She traveled the world. She ended up in France right before World War II broke out, having bluffed her way into a reporting job for Hearst newspapers. She traveled. It's astonishing to me because as a young woman, one of her first jobs as a journalist was to interview Adolf Hitler. 10 years later, she ends up killing a Nazi with her bare hands. And this story is really how a woman goes from that to that. And of course, World War II changed everything for her. Right when she falls in love and gets married, the Germans invade France. World War II breaks open, and Nancy has to decide whether she's going to stand by and do nothing or whether she's going to do something. And she was not the sort of woman to stand by and do nothing. So she became a courier for the French resistance, smuggling documents back and forth across the country. That led to smuggling people back and forth across the country. And she became so good at her job that the Gestapo put a 5 million franc price on her head. She was the most wanted person in any theater throughout the war. So of course she was faced with the very possible reality of being captured and killed or having to escape. She chose the latter. She fled into Spain, went directly to England, joined the Special Operations Executive, and ended up being flown back into France and parachuted in behind enemy lines, where leading up to D-Day, she led 7,000 French resistance soldiers into battle against the Germans. It's all true. None of that is a spoiler. That's just
Wow.
set up to the story. More than anything, I was astonished. I'd read so many stories about women spies, and I respect them and admire them. But she was the only female military leader during World War II that I'd ever read about. And her story called to me and became codename Helene.
That's amazing. It always surprises me how every time we think we've heard all the stories, you people go find new stories. It's amazing. Thank you, Ariel. Now I'd like to introduce you to my dear friend, Lauren Willig, and get comfy because her bio takes a while. Lauren Willig is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of the Pink Carnation series and 5 standalone works of historical fiction and 3 historical fiction novels co-written with Karen White and Beatrice Williams. Her books have been awarded the Rita, the Bookseller's Best and Golden Leaf Awards, and chosen for the American Library Association's annual list of best genre fiction. After graduating from Yale, she embarked on a PhD in English history at Harvard before leaving academia to acquire a law degree at Harvard while authoring her Pink Carnation series of Napoleonic set novels, because everyone writes a series of novels while they're in law school. Lauren, please tell us about yourself and your upcoming Banda Sisters.
Well, as you can see, I'm a big slacker.
You are.
So I'm in New York with my preschooler and my first grader. I'm a native New Yorker, although I grew up being convinced that Manhattan was a semi-detached part of England. And all I wanted to do was break through the right part of Central Park and wind up somewhere where men wore knee breeches and women wielded fans, and life was much more colorful and interesting than 1980s New York. And so, of course, the best way to do that seemed to write myself into it. So like Fiona, I write dual timeline novels mostly. I am fascinated by the interplay of past and present, by the way things that happened generations ago affect our lives in ways that we don't even realize now, that choices our grandparents made reverberate down to us, and our lives are shaped by those without our even knowing the stories, or the way we inherit twisted stories that then shape us. So of course, all that being said, so I wrote about 20 dual timeline books, and largely about English people. And this book I'm here to talk about tonight is neither about English people nor is it dual timeline. It's a single timeline book about Americans, but this was a story I stumbled into and I fell in love with, and I just had to write about it, even though it ran contrary to all the things I've always done before. Banda Sisters is based on the true story of the Smith College Relief Unit, who were 18 Smith College grads who went off to France at the height of World War I to bring humanitarian aid to French villagers right behind the front lines. And I was fascinated by what makes a well-educated, upper middle class American girl decide to get up and move to the middle of a war zone, living in the midst of mud, literally wrestling with pigs, fighting German guns, French bureaucracy, snarky British army officers who are like, women in our war zone, why are you here? Go away. And they're like, no, really, we're not going away. Have you ever met an American college woman before? No. And so I was fascinated by what would motivate people to do this. And I was lucky enough to find a treasure trove of documents. So I got to delve deep into what happened to these amazing women over the course of their time in France. So Band of Sisters is my love song to female friendships, to women working together, and to finding hope in really dark times. And it's also, I think, my payoff for having attended an all-girls school for 13 years, because now I get to use that experience. Anyway, thank you so much, Andrea, for being our den mother, as always, and for bringing this group of amazing, amazing women together. And I am so excited, Joy, to be here to celebrate your launch day. So happy launch to you.
Thank you, Lauren. And finally, the star of the day, let me introduce Joy Jordan Lake. Joy, thank you so much for being here on your pub day. Tell us about you and your book.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And first of all, thank you to you and Great Thoughts, Great Readers and Get Read, and to these amazing writers. And writing can be a pretty isolated profession. And it would be so much more fun if we could all be together and I could treat for margaritas afterwards by the beach. But if you'll just give me a rain check, I would love to do that again someday. But I just really appreciate your time. I love all your books and they're lined up here. And thank you so much for being part of this evening. I have the oddest resume you've ever seen in your life. I look sort of like the poster child of don't let this happen to you. Please find a guidance counselor. I've been a college professor. I trained to be a college professor in 19th century British literature and American literature. And I am not doing that currently. I'm not, I have been a Pizza Hut waitress. I've been a lifeguard, and I worked through a church years ago in Boston, running a food pantry and clothes closet for homeless women and families. And so I've just been all over the map. But behind this particular book, I think I always wanted to be a writer, but I come from a long line of very practical people. You know, you kind of need a job that actually you can know will pay a bill. And some of you may have that same feeling. You can't just say, I think I'll be a writer someday, you know, right? But I always wrote on the side when I was grading, you know, English compositions or running a food pantry, whatever I was doing. I always wanted to write. So I'm really grateful for the chance to do that. But like a lot of you guys, a lot of my stories come from either a place or a person. And the more obscure, the better as far as the people. I've always admired Ariel and Jane and the rest of you for, you know, finding these great hidden stories about a person and then weaving your stories about that. And for me, it's often been started with a place. Charleston was my last novel. And I tend to be drawn to a place and then have to go find the stories, the kind of hidden people who made a difference, either for the good or the really terrible. And this one, that's how this happened with this one. I've always been really, really nuts about the North Carolina mountains, the Blue Ridge, and grew up hiking there a lot and working a lot of summers there. And one summer when I was about 20, 21 years old, I was, and this was my favorite job title I've ever had or ever will have, I was the head sailing instructor on Lake Eden at Camp Rockmont for boys in Black Mountain, North Carolina. and the job was every bit as much fun as it sounds. Had a blast. But one day I was just finishing up work and I was completely, you know, kind of still dripping in lake water, and my hair was all stiff with kind of that, you know, fish fertilizer feel. And I had on ratty cut off jeans and this old Georgia Tech t-shirt. I didn't even go to Georgia Tech, and but it was cute and it was in the clearance bin. So I had this thing on and I was just a wreck. And I heard, oh, all of us are going over to Deanie's house tonight. We're invited, all of us who are in charge of the skills, the different sports at Camp Rockmont, we're all invited over to her house. And I was like, who's Deanie? Oh, Deanie's the son of the camp owner. She's the girlfriend of the son of the camp owner. Okay, fine. I didn't care who Deanie was because I didn't have to fight with adolescent boys just to get a good dinner that night. So I was all in. Free pizza, I'm there. Don't have to fight with 12-year-olds. So this is great. I'm in my 79 Mercury Zephyr with all dented up. It was such a great car, and it was ancient even then. And, you know, this is pre-GPS, so I didn't really know where I was going. I was just following the guy in front of me. Here we go to this Deanie's house, and we get to the Biltmore estate gates. And instead of paying or turning us away because we look like heck, they wave us on through. And I'm like, what are we doing? We drive through the Biltmore estate, and we finally, you know, we're driving. We stop in the middle, and I'm still, what on earth? We get out, we're greeted in this lovely house by this woman who's my age. She's like 20, 21. She's so gracious and down to earth, just lovely, lovely person. Deanie, the girlfriend of the son of the camp owner. She has us all in. We're eating pizza. I'm slugging back Diet Cokes. And I'm looking out this window behind her house at the back of her living room, and it's looking over these gorgeous fields and this killer view of Biltmore House. And if you don't know Biltmore House, it's the largest private residence in the United States. It's a French chateau, essentially a castle, an American castle. It's massive, 250 rooms. But more importantly, it's surrounded by gorgeous mountains. It's just unbelievable setting. And I'm looking at this thing going, okay, we're the same age, and my view back in my apartment when I'm in grad school, my apartment is like halfway buried underground. So my window is looking out into the parking lot to people's undercarriages of their cars, like that's my view. And I'm sitting there thinking, like why, what, the view? And finally someone leans over, realizing I'm completely clueless, and says, Deanie is Deanie Cecil. Well, that still doesn't mean anything to me. And they said, she and her brother are going to inherit all this, the Biltmore house and the estate. And I'm just, I'm choking on my Diet Coke and my pizza, of course, thinking, what? We're in a little different season of life here, Deanie and me. And, but it was so striking. This woman is so down to earth, so lovely. And I sat there looking at the Biltmore house that night, me and my ratty t-shirt, and thinking, wow, okay, this is fascinating. Here I am, and yet I would have here's George Vanderbilt, all I knew about him at the time was that he was this multimillionaire. He'd moved down from New York. He traveled the world. And I think I knew at the time he loved books, horses, and dogs, which is all I need to know that I want you to be my friend. And he had decided, of all the places all over the world that he traveled, he decided he wanted to build his dream home in the North Carolina mountains. So I remember sitting there thinking, I like this guy, like just the fact that he would choose the mountains that I loved so much, that would be the place he would build this beautiful home. And I sat there thinking, this would be a really good place to set like a mystery, a murder mystery, or some kind of very suspenseful novel. Wouldn't that be fun? And but years went by, and just to fast forward, the moment I knew I didn't want to write about George Vanderbilt, because as I bet most of you all have found, if you have too much historical information about someone, your imagination doesn't get to fill in a lot. So it's fun just to have some information and not all. But there's so much information about him. I knew I didn't want him to be the main character. And also, I'm from the mountains myself. And so it was the moment when, as I was doing research, a tour guide at the Biltmore said, well, toward the end of acquiring land, George Vanderbilt, who tried to be very generous in his payment of the mountain people as he acquired all this acreage, ran into a couple of families right at the very end who refused to sell. Money meant nothing to them. They wanted to keep their family farms no matter what. And I thought, that's it. And it was like this woman appeared in my head, this young woman, very feisty, who had lived in New York, who had the education, who had that she could swim in the sea of the Gilded Age wealth, but she was from the mountains. Those were her people, and she was not going to sell her family farm. So she's the main character, and she's a lot tougher than I am. She can make bootlaces out of squirrel hide. So she was. So anyway, that's the novel.
That's amazing. I think we should all gather at the Biltmore estate in the future, hopefully in the not too distant future. And I love chatting with authors because then they said, and this person appears in my head. So I love it when you guys are talking to people in your heads. It's great. So now why don't we all chat about research? So Ariel, let's start with you. Where did you find the most interesting research about Nancy Wake?
Two things. The most interesting thing was from her biography, to be honest with you. She published a book in 1980, I believe. It was 80 or 86. Fuzzy on the dates. And she told her life story from beginning to end. And it was where I found many of the most fascinating stories about her. It was where I was able to hear her voice so that I could reproduce it on the page. And to be honest with you, it was where I found a lot of the really funny one-liners. She was hilarious. The book is set during World War II, so it's devastating in parts and it's really tragic in parts. It has teeth, but it also has a lot of humor because she was funny. And I always tell people after they've read the book, they can go on YouTube and pull up videos of Nancy in her later years, and you'll see it right there. She never lost her sense of humor. She never lost her sass. And as I read her biography and several others that were written about her, I began to wonder where all of her articles were. She wrote for Hearst for close to 5 years, and none of her biographers quote from them. She doesn't quote from them. I couldn't find them anywhere. And I went on this mad, frantic search to find them. I wanted to find the article in which she interviewed Hitler. I wanted to find the articles where she was describing World War II as it spilled onto the streets in front of her. And I couldn't find any of them. And it took months and months and months before I finally found a library, a university librarian, who told me two things. Hearst does not make their articles available online. And at the time, they did not print the name of their female journalists. So none of her articles were filed or printed with her name, and they were more than likely filed under the name of her supervisor, completely lost to history. So here is this woman who's literally being erased from history, even as she was writing it. And it was astonishing to me because none of the women sitting here would tolerate that today. We all want to get credit for our work. And for some reason, that detail made her so real to me. And it made real the responsibility that I have as a novelist, as a historical novelist, to make sure these stories aren't forgotten, to find these people, to make sure that our kids and grandkids know them. I really do believe Nancy Wake should be a household name. Little girls should dress up as her for Halloween. But I would have never known any of that if not for my friend and if not for the deep dive into the handful of nonfiction books that have been written about her.
That's amazing. So Jane, same kind of question to you. What was the best of your primary resources for the Secret Stealers?
Well, one of them, I brought it over and I still have the tabs on it. This is just a jumping off point. I have several books, several online resources, but this one is The Woman of the OSS, Sisterhood of Spies by Elizabeth Mcintosh. It was published by Naval Institute Press, really small press. And she not only wrote about her experiences, but it was like a memoir of her, but also all of her friends. So that was in the OSS and their experiences all over the world. So that was this was the jumping off point for me. The other amazing, I'm sorry, my cats are fighting in the background. They usually get along. The other amazing part of the research and most helpful was for my birthday/research trip, my husband and I went to Paris, and I found a historian over there. His name's Nigel Perrin, and he took me on a walking tour of Paris to I had so many questions about the OSS and the French Resistance, and I knew Paris was almost going to be like another character in the book. So he spent like almost the whole day with us, taking us all over the place to lesser known places and also places that you would expect. And that was really invaluable and actually changed kind of the arc of the story in some ways. So yeah, the Woman of the OSS book here was the jumping off point, and the trip to Paris was definitely the highlight of my research.
That's great. So Fiona, did you just go to the library to research? I love that. Every time I think Fiona can't find another building to write about, she like nails it. And this one was your research at the library?
It's what happened first was that I just started doing research online to see what was there. And I went on the New York Times archival website and found this amazing article from 1941 that talked about the retirement of the super of the New York Public Library and about how he had moved into this 4-bedroom apartment that's deep inside the library with his wife and his 3 kids right before it opened in 1911. And he lived there with his wife and his kids for 30 years, that his daughter was born in the library. It had all these great things about how the kids used to play baseball using books as bases in the reading room until they got caught. And that the sun raised pigeons on the roof. And the minute I read that, I just thought, wow, a family living in the New York Public Library, there you go. I'm done. And it was really wonderful because they were so helpful. They gave me a behind the scenes tour where I got to see the old apartment, which is still there, but now it is storage and offices, but you could see exactly how it was set up. And you could see these huge windows. And that was really, really wonderful. And so I was able to kind of get behind the scenes and and get a feel of what that family would feel like as they lived in that apartment, and take it from there, which was great. And even better, they had all the archives from the superintendent. And so I could go through his payroll and see that 90 people worked for him, that this was a major job, you know, running the infrastructure of the building, and kind of all the letters of complaint and all that, and all those little details. I don't, you know, I'm sure everybody feels the same way. It's finding those details that really make the story come alive, because then, you know, you really feel like you've tapped into the historical record.
That's amazing. Okay, Lauren, you found a story that was not British. How did you learn of our friends, the Smithies?
Well, I stumbled into them entirely by accident and learned more about them while procrastinating, because that's usually the way life works for me. Beatrice Williams and Karen White and I wrote a book that was set in World War I France, World War II France, and 1960s Paris. And so for the World War I portion, which was set in occupied France, one of the things we needed to know was, how would Christmas have been celebrated in Picardy during World War I? So we went hunting for Picard Christmas customs in World War I, as one does. And one of the things that popped up was a memoir called The Ladies of Grey Court by a woman named Ruth Gaines, who I'd never heard of. And it was about Christmas parties, but it wasn't about traditional Pickard Christmas traditions. It was about this group of Smithies out in the Somme, 9 miles behind the front lines, dressing up as Santa Claus and throwing Christmas parties for French villagers. And I was like, what on earth is a group of Smithies doing out in the Somme right in the middle of World War I? This made no sense to me. And so, of course, I couldn't resist. I read the whole memoir and discovered that, in fact, so history nerd moment, which I guess we all are here. But so, yeah, we know a lot about the occupation of France in World War II, but what a lot of people don't realize is that France was also occupied in World War I, or at least part of it. Not as much of it, but a substantial chunk. And in March of 1917, the Germans were finally pushed back. Not all the way, but a bit. But the problem was, before they left, they decided to wreak maximum havoc on the territory they were exiting. So they piled all the villagers into one village and then went around systematically destroying all the houses, poisoning all the wells, breaking all the plows, basically destroying everything that could give shelter or sustenance to these people. Then they take them, and the people left were women, children, the elderly, the infirm, babies. All the able-bodied men and women had already been shipped off to work camps in Germany, which, I mean, you can sort of see Germany previewing some of the things they were going to try in the next World War. But anyway, so these poor remaining villagers were sent back to their villages and told, okay, go home now, enjoy. But of course, the idea was that they would starve and be a burden on the French government, and this would impede the French war effort. But they hadn't reckoned on an American Smith alum named Harriet Boyd Hawes, who heard about this and came back to the US and gave this rousing speech at the Smith College Club in April of 1917, saying, okay, we've got this humanitarian crisis going on, and clearly what's needed to solve this is a group of American college women. Who's with me? And people signed up. So within 3 months, she had funding, she had trucks, and she had 18 Smithies on a boat to France, some with social service training, some who knew how to drive, not very well, but, you know, 2 female doctors. They were an all-women group funded by the Smith Alumni Association, and they were there to single-handedly rescue this corner of France. And it's just honestly the most amazing story. It's one of those things where the more I delved into the sources, the more I kept thinking this can't really be happening, but everything it did. I mean, they wind up when the Germans push forward again in March of 1918, they wind up helping to direct traffic for the British Great Retreat, and they evacuate thousands of villagers. Like, you can't make this stuff up. Oh, and they also get hens and roosters confused, because, you know, it's one thing to evacuate thousands of villagers, but figuring out what a chicken is really hard.
Awesome. I might have read an early copy of Lauren's book, and I called her and I had to go through and say, was this real? Was this real? Was this real? Because why read the author's note if you have the author's phone number? And everything I asked her about was real. And so I can't wait for everyone to read it. Okay, Joy, tell us, what was the best source material for the Biltmore?
you know, there were a bunch of them because I've, you know, signed on to a place, unfortunately, rather than a person or an event. So I had to go digging for, okay, what was going on in the 1890s? What were people thinking about? What were, and I learned that the people who built the Biltmore were primarily Italian stonecutters. I mean, hundreds of them who came in, shipped in from Sicily, and my husband's family is from Sicily. So that was kind of a fun connection. So I started digging in that, and I didn't know, maybe you all did, but I somehow missed in history class that in the early 1890s in New Orleans, there was a lynching of like 14 Italians. They were essentially, the Italian community was framed essentially for the murder of the chief of police. Probably didn't do it. That's a whole interesting story, but 14 are lynched, and some of them escaped. So of course, one of my main characters, one of the three main characters who tells the story, is one of the Italians who has escaped from that lynching, but is still wanted for the murder of the chief of police in New Orleans. So that was a fun thing to kind of stumble on, and just all the prejudice against Italians, which is, you know, again, very interesting in this era, and being married to someone from Sicily and Calabria. Another thing I stumbled on was the eugenics movement, which we all learned about in school, but I don't think I ever realized how much American intellectuals from all our Ivy League institutions and just some of our best and brightest were involved in the eugenics movement. And one of them I'd never heard of before, Madison Grant, actually ended up writing, he was exactly George Vanderbilt's age. They ran in the same social circles. So he ends up, in my book, coming to Biltmore as one of George's guests to stay, because they ran, and, you know, again, their families knew each other. His family donated to the Bronx Zoo, which Madison Grant founded. He's partly responsible for Glacier National Park. I mean, he was really, but he saved the American buffalo. So he did all these good things, but he got more and more and more involved in the eugenics movement, to the point that his conservation efforts with land became, in his mind, conservation of the white race. And it becomes this really horrifying stuff as he gets older and older and writes more and more. And he ended up writing a book that Adolf Hitler wrote him a fan letter for before World War II. Adolf Hitler was a big fan. So if that gives you any idea. But he was a Yale graduate. Sorry, Lauren. He was, you know, just this really fascinating, complex character. So he's one of the characters, and one debutante from New Orleans who's running away from some scandal that she's trying to sort of outrun. But I just, you know, it's fascinating I love those moments when you find these people that nobody's ever heard of, and all of you have talked about those, and you know, and it's this fascinating person, either so brave and so courageous, or so scary and despicable. But those are just really great moments. And then secondly, like, why haven't we ever heard of these people is the other kind of interesting thing.
Okay, I have plenty of questions, but you guys are very popular because we have so many questions from the audience that I'm going to start working on those. And I think I'll just field them to one of you so we can get through all of these. An aspiring author named Christina asks, one thing I'm interested in hearing is, when you're basing your protagonist on a real historical character, do you ever feel like you're poaching that person's life? As a reader, I enjoy having real historical characters appear as secondary characters, but sometimes I wonder if I'd rather read that person's biography. So she'd like thoughts on that. Ariel, since your book was based on a person, what do you think?
That's a great question. And it's something I have worried about off and on throughout my career. I never set out to write about real people, and I don't know how I've continued to do so other than the stories find me. But I do have a few criteria that I use when pursuing a story. The person has to be dead. I won't write about somebody that's currently living. That is absolutely unfair. The person, typically, I'm trying to think, with the exception of Anastasia Romanov, I did write about her. Most of my characters no one has ever heard of, so they're lesser known. And I do not deviate from historical fact. So if I can prove it in history, it stays. Like, for instance, one of my novels is set on the last ill-fated flight of the Hindenburg. All of the characters in the book are real. If they lived in real life, they live in the book. If they died in real life, they died in the book. I don't deviate. But the other thing is, this is history, and history is relevant to us today. And like I said earlier, some of these stories we can't lose. And there are times when there is no biography. There's no memoir, there's no nonfiction about a character that can be found. So I move carefully. Two of my characters wrote their own autobiography, so I was able to piece their lives back together with their memories and their words and their recollections, and I stayed true to that. Sometimes I don't have their actual words and I have to use my imagination. But I always find my stories in the gaps between what we know. I'm looking for the central question about a moment's life. Take the Hindenburg, for example. What caused that explosion? We don't know. So that is fair game to me. And then recreating the lives of those people on board was fair game. So I try to stay very true to historical facts, and I try not to misrepresent people. I know that they have living family members. In one case, actually, I've had family members write to me after reading the book. And if history portrays somebody as a villain, I feel like I'm allowed to put that in the book.
Sure.
But to answer the question, I proceed with caution. I'm very aware that there are probably people in the world today that love that character. So I try to treat their memories with respect. And I'm always very, very clear in my author's note at the end about the parts that I fictionalized versus the parts that are true. And if I have taken liberties anywhere, I'm very clear there. So there's no misrepresentation at the end of the book.
Great, thank you. Fiona, Antonia asked, I'm wondering if Fiona ever found period images of the apartment in the library, and do you spend time within the landmark buildings to absorb the ambiance and feel your characters moving about?
Yeah, you know, I could not find any photographs of that actual apartment. I found photographs of other superintendent apartments around New York because many of the libraries had them, but not the one in the New York Public Library, unfortunately. But the best thing about working there is that they have something called the Allen Room, and it's for writers with book contracts. And so I was able to get a desk in the Allen Room. So I was writing a book about the library in the library. And when you're there, you can get books delivered to you, you know, to your bookshelf on. So I would have books on typhoid or the construction of the library or whatever, you know, whatever I needed, which was great. But the best thing was really the librarians because they were so helpful. And at one point in an early draft of the book, I had a dead body. It's not there now, but in early, you guys know, you go through, there are dead bodies and then you get rid of them. But I reached out to one of the librarians and I said, look, if you had to hide a dead body in the New York Public Library, where should I put it? And she wrote back right away with, oh, down in the basement near the carpenter's room. And I was like, that is fat. She didn't, you know, blink an eye. And I'm sure we're both under surveillance at this point. But it was just wonderful to get that kind of firsthand knowledge and feel like I was part of the building. So that way the building can really become a character in the book itself.
That's amazing. And hopefully we're not under surveillance, but all of you should be for your Google histories. Okay, Lauren, do you get attached to your characters? How do you adjust transitioning from one book project to the next? Probably a great question for you since you have many balls in the air.
You know, it's very hard. And the past couple of books, I found it very hard to detach from. I write in close viewpoint with my characters, and I'm a very character-driven author. And it's funny, I have sort of the opposite of what Ariel does. I've always written about my imaginary people placed in a real landscape. And most of my people are put together out of fragments of real people. I'm sort of like Dr. Frankenstein. I stitch bits and pieces together and steal bits of different people's brains, and then put them into the real world to see what they'll do. And so they're very personal to me, and I'm living in their heads so much, and in their worlds, it's often very hard to get away from them. I think in this case, it helped that my last two books have been so different. The one before the Smith book was set in Barbados in the early 19th century around a doomed love affair and a rising of enslaved people. And so moving from that to World War I Smithies was in many ways very easy because the tones are so different. I had thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of letters that the Smithies themselves wrote home. So I was able to sort of get into their voice, and they all sounded like Rilla of Ingleside. So somehow that made it easier to have a clean break between my very broody early 19th century Barbados characters and these really snarky, flippant Smithies who are there in a war zone sassing British officers.
Awesome. My friend Lauren Margolin, the Good Book Fairy, has a great question. Joy, why don't you take this one? Lauren says, and this is so Lauren, hi, I seem to get lost doing my own research with simple things like which Instapot to buy. Does one nugget lead to another nugget, lead to another? How do you know when to stop?
Oh my gosh. Tell her if she figures it out, please tell me, because that's what, that's part of just the delight, but also the danger of the research part, because you could, for any of these books, you could spend the rest of your life researching and never actually write the story. So I've learned the hard way. My last novel was, I started before any of my books, and then actually it didn't get published until 20 years later. So meanwhile, I did way too much research. And I did a lot of research that I had to throw out on that novel because it had been so long. So I'm learning to make sure I really understand what the story is going to be before I dig too deep. But then you have to keep doing research too to even know where the story's going. So it's kind of a dance, at least for me. Some others might have other thoughts, but I have to really be careful because I have a huge stack of, if you could see the other side of my office, books that I just checked out, including like cars from the 1950s. And I mean, that I hope I need for my next novel, but I really don't need to know how a Bentley in the 1950s was constructed, but I suddenly am reading about it, so it can be a lot of fun, but you kind of have to watch yourself because your writing time, sometimes I'll make sure that I, for example, do the writing first, and then whatever time I have left that day, I get to go do the research or things like that, just to make sure that I don't end up doing so much research that I'm not going to meet my writing deadline. But others of you guys may have great thoughts on that.
Speaking of cars, Lauren had very interesting vehicles in her upcoming book that I actually went and Googled because I really thought she made them up, but she didn't. So now we have a question from Charlene Moore, who we all know and love. Jane, why don't you start with this one? Charlene loves to read books recommended by favorite authors. When you have time, what are you reading?
I have time. Yeah. Well, I feel like it's such a gift to be able to have so many author friends, but when I'm in the midst of writing something historical, I tend to not read historical fiction. I try to, I'm just so afraid of things bleeding into my work, even subconsciously. But what am I reading? Right now I'm reading Troubled Blood because I was on vacation. So I had downloaded some mysteries, and that's by last name Galbraith. It's really J.K. Rowling.
Right.
Yeah, it's
right.
So it's J.K. Rowling's series. It's a mystery series. It's really well done, and it was like total escape book. But yeah, I mean, I love being able to read for my friends and historical fiction when I can. Like I love Joy's book, and I was able to blurb that. I think it's a dream come true, really, to be able to read for my friends. That's like the best thing ever. So
that's awesome. Fiona, when you're not blurbing every book that's coming out, what do you like to read?
Yeah, I love reading historical fiction. I really do. It's just, I learn something from every book I read. And especially in this group of authors, you're just, it's incredible. But yeah, I've recently loved The Invisible Life of Addie Larue.
Oh, my daughter's reading that.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's a good one. It's epic. And, apparently the author V.E. Schwab took 10 years to write it. She normally writes fantasy, and this was going off in a kind of a new direction. And she was very worried she'd alienate all her readers. And it's brilliant. And it's just such an original concept. I'm still kind of in awe of it.
That's on my list.
That's what I keep hearing. I need to start it. Ariel, what are you reading?
Well, let's see. I am currently working my way through Louise Penny's series.
Great.
I'm very much like Jane. If I am reading or writing historical, I struggle to read it. Not because I'm afraid of it bleeding in, although that's a little bit, honestly, it just makes me want to quit because I'm comparing my messy draft to somebody else's beautiful, perfect, astonishing novel. And I just get depressed and I want to quit and go become a greeter at Walmart. But then I heard they're doing away with the greeters, so I'm absolutely sunk. But my plan for the rest of this year and going into 2021 is to read authors in their totality, like to read through their body of work. I'm doing that with Louise Penny. I'm doing that with Pat Conroy. I'm rereading the Outlander series in anticipation of the next book coming out. So I want to be immersed in these different worlds for a longer stretch of time than one book will give me.
That's great. You need to read the Lucinda Riley Seven Sisters series.
I'm writing it down.
They're deep and long and fabulous. Okay, Lauren, what are you reading?
Okay, well, I'm like Ariel and Jane. I have a lot of trouble reading, even though I grew up reading historical fiction. I write historical fiction because I love historical fiction. I have a lot of trouble reading it while I'm writing it. Although usually for me, it's time period limited. If I'm writing a World War I book, I can read Regency and vice versa. But I found that something about the pandemic has changed the way I read. I am in comfort reading panic mode where I have to read comfortable, safe, and familiar things, but at the same time, not rereads, which is weird because I'm usually a serial rereader and love to live back in familiar worlds. So I've been doing what Ariel is doing and reading through mystery series. So as soon as we went into lockdown in New York in March, I started on the recommendation of a good friend of mine, the first in the Silver series of Patricia Wentworth mysteries. She's like a lesser Agatha Christie you have never heard of. And she wrote like 50 books about this knitting spinster who's omniscient and solves every mystery ever in these quaint little English villages where there's always scones at the vicarage and the bad person is always discovered and usually is someone who wears too much lipstick. And they are fabulous, deeply reassuring. I'm up to like 48 right now, and I don't know what I'm going to do when I'm done with them. So all I've been able to read have been Miss Silver, her American equivalent, Mary Roberts Reinhardt, who I've begun to think of as sort of proto-Nancy Drew, and random rom-coms. Like boyfriend material was the highlight of my summer.
Loved it.
That's what I've been subsisting on. And I keep trying to go, I have this pile of arcs that I intellectually really want to read, but I can't quite make myself open them. And then I go and take out another over from the library.
I think it's 2020 right now. I think reading is like mac and cheese. It's comfort food. And we just have to read mac and cheese books. Okay, Joy, we're going to throw you the last big question. First, what are you reading? And second, what do you want us all to take from Under a Gilded Moon?
Reading, that's interesting. I'm reading a lot of mystery too. And I also have to watch myself if I, not just historical novels, but really anything can send me into that spiral of what the heck do I think I'm doing? Why do I even think I'm a writer? And I'm just spiraling down and I'm thinking, and I can't even get my old job as head sailing instructor back again because I'm probably a little old for that now. And I've lost the Georgia Tech t-shirt. And, but mysteries are more a safe, even if they're gorgeously written, for some reason that just feels safer. I don't know why. The Jacqueline Winspear, Maisie Dobbs series I've loved lately. I'm listening, and it's kind of confusing because I'm always listening to one book in my car and then reading another. So I stay confused a lot, but love that. And love the, Ariel actually turned me on to Louise Penny, big fan of hers. And we got to hear her speak, and she's just as fun and charming in person as she is in her books. And I started watching during quarantine, watching the Grantchester PBS series. So I started, I didn't realize it had come from a mystery series. So I went and looked him up, James Runcie's series. So that's been fun to kind of plunge in. And I always pull out an Agatha Christie too. If I really am deep in need of comfort food, that's always fun. What do we take away from Under a Gilded Moon? I had never said about one of my books, I don't think before the pandemic, I hope it's a good escape for people, because I associate escapist, fiction is like, I don't know, stuff you sell in a dime store and sell for 10 cents. But we all sort of need to escape right now and can't travel. And so I guess I've hoped that during this time when it keeps getting more and more difficult, and that the story, like y'all's stories, can be a chance to travel and just get away from your own problems for a while and learn something too, be the fun of solving a puzzle, a mystery, that fun and that sense of fulfillment to figure out who did it. I hope readers have that fun. But also, I was struck writing it how many parallels there were in the 1890s, the kinds of things they struggled with culturally and politically that are exactly our cultural and political struggles now. I mean, it was just smack me in the face all the time. And I think I would hope readers would take that away too, that okay, we've faced these awful debates before and been very, very divided, and somehow found ways to keep going and keep talking to each other. So that was very intriguing to me. So I hope that strikes readers too, wow, this sounds like what we're talking about now. And okay, let's learn from the past. So
perfect. I love it. Well, on behalf of Get Read PR and Great Thoughts, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I think we had over 150 chiming in. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everybody's questions. And I really hope we can do this next year in New York or the Biltmore, or the New York Library, or something super exciting. But if not, we'll all do this on Zoom again. How's that sound?
Be fun.
Sounds
Great.
good.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.